Hello, today we're going to be testing 15 Mac games on the new 15-inch MacBook Air with M3. Enjoy. Up first is Death Stranding by Kojima. Now this is a good game to start with, as in my opinion it's probably one of the best optimized games to try on any MacBook Air, in fact, because based on my experience this game doesn't get too hot when playing on these fanless devices. It does get hot, but it's not, it's not dramatic. So I first played the game at 1080p medium with metal effects on temporal and balanced. I played the game for about 20 or so minutes in this mode, and it would reach an outside surface temperature of about 46 degrees, which is pretty good. And the frame rate would only go down to about 40 FPS during the worst case scenarios, which was when I was encountering the beached things. I also did try the game at 1080p high with metal effects off so that the game could look as good as it could. And then I capped the frame rate to 30, and for me it was pretty much a locked 30 FPS. Even during very challenging cutscenes, especially this opening one, which has been quite a bit of an issue on earlier Mac devices or iPad or iPhone 15 Pro, and during boss encounters with these weird gooey creatures and so forth. I was also really happy to see that this game didn't really use over 8 GB of memory in my testing. When playing Death Stranding at 1080p high, the outside surface temperature reached 46 degrees as well. Moving on, we have Grid Legends by PHARAOH Interactive. Now with Grid Legends, PHARAOH recommend playing at their default settings when you launch the game. In this case, it's 1080p with a 30 FPS cap, VSync disabled, and most settings are on high, and metal effects is off. Now this game comes with a benchmark mode, so at 1080p default or recommended settings it's seeing an average FPS of 29.63, and for me the outside surface temperature was 44.6 degrees here. I then tried the game at 1080p medium with anti-aliasing on metal effects spatial upscaler and balanced mode. With these settings, the benchmark saw an average FPS of 55.463, and the outside surface temperature was about 45.8 degrees. Last, I then tried the game at 1080p high with metal effects off. The average FPS in the benchmark was 45.972, and the temperature was 44 degrees. I'm pretty impressed with these results. PHARAOH Interactive optimize their games really well on Mac and often test them under very intense circumstances, so you've got them covered for a fanless device in many circumstances. But I would still go with their default settings, as that is what they recommend and that is what they actually told me for you guys to use on this device. I also didn't see the game use over 8 GB of memory. Up next is Resident Evil 4 by Capcom. I first tried the game at 1080p with prioritized performance preset, and metal effects upscaling was set to performance. Metal effects in this game, I believe, uses spatial upscaling, so it doesn't look very good, but it does provide pretty good performance. In this battle encounter, which is pretty early on in the game, it's generally receiving a bit over 60 FPS. However, here, in another challenging, this one's a very challenging battle encounter, it can go below 60 frames. But this is a very challenging area that I've tested on multiple machines, so I'm not too surprised that it's tanking here. When I was playing at 1080p prioritized performance, the outside surface temperature reached about 45.7 degrees. I then tried the game at 1080p, prioritized graphics with a 30 FPS cap, and metal effects was off. This is honestly my preferred way to play RE4 here. 30 FPS works pretty well for this title, as the game is a little bit more fast-paced than RE Village, but you can get by, in my opinion, but some may disagree. Anyway, the game looks pretty good without metal effects as well, and overall it just provides a more consistent experience. There are a few encounters that you can see where it will have a few issues. It was, however, quite significant during this encounter fairly early on in the game, and it could go below 30 frames. When playing at 1080p prioritized graphics, the outside surface temperature reached 45.8 degrees with this one. I then tried RE Village, which has much better performance. Anyway, I first tried the game at 1080p, prioritized performance, with metal effects on quality. With metal effects on quality, the game doesn't look nearly as bad as RE4, which I found had better performance with metal effects on performance. One scene I found where it did go below 60 FPS was when trying to find some random red chimney or something, and you encounter these beasts and it would go below 60 FPS, but still it didn't use that much of the memory here. With these settings, the temperature reached about 45 degrees. I then tried the game at 1080p max settings, but I capped the frame rate to 30 and I disabled metal effects. And the game looks absolutely beautiful playing at native 1080p and max settings. What you do need to keep in mind here is that I don't suggest doing this on a 8GB config, because this uses, in some cases, quite a bit over 8GB of memory, so you may face performance issues. The frame pacing also isn't perfect, but it didn't really dip too far below 30 FPS in the worst case scenarios. It also reached a max outside surface temperature of only 44.2 degrees for me. Now we're going to take a look at Lies of P. I first tried the game at 1080p medium settings with metal effects on balanced. Now what's interesting with Lies of P is that I found it has mixed performance on this machine. I previously went and tested Lies of P on last year's 15-inch MacBook Air, and it didn't have the same issues here. There was an annoying FPS issue where it would just randomly tinker or whatever. Very, very distracting and made the game honestly unplayable, because this game requires a stable FPS to battle foes or for parrying and blocking and so forth. So it made the game unplayable for me, in my opinion. If that wasn't there, the frame rate would be much higher and would be closer to 60 FPS and would be much more enjoyable. And that's what I saw on my 15-inch MacBook Air last year. So to get this game to be more playable, I had to cap the FPS to 30. However, when doing this, I could play at higher settings and I would be able to turn off metal effects. Doing this, I didn't notice the frame rate going below 30 FPS, which was pretty good, and the game would be more playable, but I think this game really requires 60 FPS to be most enjoyed. When I was playing on this machine, I noticed the max outside surface temperature was about 46.3 degrees at both 1080p high and medium as well. You also need to keep in mind that this game can often use over 8GB of memory, even at 1080p medium, so you may have performance issues on an 8GB config. Now it's time to take a look at Baldur's Gate 3 by Larian. Elvorels are no longer working on the Mac port. I first tried the game at 1080p medium with FSR, AMD FSR 1.0. I loaded up a Act 3 save, which I got from Andrew Tsai. I don't have that much time to play this game. I'm a pretty old school gamer, so I can get by even below 20 FPS. I am very used to that. For a lot of people, this is maybe not acceptable. And this is with AMD FSR on, so the game looks absolutely disgusting as well. Way earlier on in the game, this is about 20 or so minutes into the game. Yes, the frame rate was quite a bit better actually, and would be a bit over 30 FPS often. What people are finding online is that once you get into Act 3 of this game, the FPS absolutely tanks and the game becomes pretty unplayable. I then want to see how the game would play at 1080p medium without AMD FSR enabled. Here's Act 3, and it's pretty bad, down into below 20 FPS. In some cases, down to about 10 FPS. And then I would drop into an earlier save, 20 minutes or so into the game, and it would be about down to 30 FPS, and in some cases lower. What I also found when playing at 1080p medium is that the device would get really, really hot, about 55.8 degrees outside surface temperature-ish, and so forth. So that is another issue. It throttles really, really hard here, which is having an impact on the performance. I then tried the game at 900p low with AMD FSR balanced. This makes the game much more playable, but it's still at about 30 to 50 FPS. So it's not a dramatic improvement that I would like to see when lowering the settings dramatically. Some major optimization or work needs to be done on this port. This is not a good example of this MacBook Air's performance because this is just a lazy port. Next is No Man's Sky, which absolutely flies on this machine. I first tried the game at 1080p enhanced with Metal Effects Temporal on performance. So on this first world, it was usually about over 100 FPS, sometimes down to about 90 or so FPS, so wonderful. This game isn't really that challenging to run though, and I don't know why it's not on iPad yet. Anyways, I then tried the game in space, and it was always over 100 FPS, but I don't really know what I'm doing in this game, so I'm not that good at providing an example. I then tried the game on this nice green lush island, and this is where it does have some performance issues and frame pacing issues. When playing at 1080p enhanced, I noticed the max outside surface temperature was about 45.7 degrees. I then tried the game at 1440p high with Metal Effects disabled. I also capped the frame rate to 30 to allow for a more consistent experience. The one thing I did notice here is that the frame pacing is pretty awful, but it is able to maintain its 30 FPS target. The game also does look quite a lot better here without Metal Effects enabled and a higher resolution. Do keep in mind these settings that I'm playing at uses over 8GB of memory. So if you're on an 8GB memory config, you will have to lower the settings a little bit to make it maybe more enjoyable, but I can't comment on that exactly. The outside surface temperature also reached about 46.5 degrees at max for me, which is pretty good. Up next is Stray by Blue 12 Studio. When you first launch the game, it has very mixed performance, but before we get into that, this is 1080p medium with Metal Effects on about 70% in the settings. The resolution scale is about 70%. The first opening chapter of this game has terrible performance on any machine, Windows or Mac, so it's not a very good example of the overall performance. But if we skip over the first chapter and go a bit later into the game, we can get a better understanding of the performance, which is about 40 to 60 or so FPS. Do keep in mind, this game can get quite a bit hot. 54.5 degrees, so quite hot. I then tried the game at 1152p high with metal effects disabled. The opening of the game was very unplayable with about 10 to 15 FPS, but later on in the game after that it was a consistent 30 FPS. I was also pretty impressed to see that the memory usage never really went over 8 GB or even close to that, so that's very good to see for the other machines with 8 gigs of memory. The outside surface temperature for this game was about 45.2 degrees at worst, so yeah. Here is SnowRunner by Saber Interactive. I first tried the game at 1080p medium. Now I can't confirm this, but in a lot of the press releases, SnowRunner supports metal effects. So I can't find metal effects in the settings, but it might be enabled in the background. Some ports have been known to do that, such as Lies of P in the past. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Anyway, I don't really know how to play this game very well. I often just kept crashing and failing each mission or whatever. But for me, it would get about 45 to 60 FPS. I'm also really impressed by the memory usage here, which is up to about 3 gigs of RAM, which is just awesome. At 1080p medium, the max outside surface temperature was 46.1 degrees at 1080p medium. I also tried the game at 1152p high, with a 30 FPS cap enabled. The frame pacing did have some issues, however, for me, the game never went below its 30 FPS target, and the memory usage was still about 3 GB. The outside surface temperature for when playing this game was about 44.8 degrees. ELEX 2, brought to you by Piranha Bytes. This is a pretty underrated AAA game to try on Mac, so give it a go. Anyway, I first tried the game at 1080p medium, with metal effects set to performance. The game is unable to reach 60 FPS. In fact, it's usually more down to about 30 to 45 FPS. And in some of the worst cases, it can go a little bit down below 30 frames. In some parts of the game, later here on in the snow, it can be up to 60 frames and doesn't go below 40 FPS as frequently. The outside surface temperature when running at 1080p medium was up to about 46.1 degrees. I then tried the game at 900p low with metal effects on performance. Still, I wouldn't suggest playing at 900p low, but I just wanted to see how the game compares when running at 900p low compared to 1080p medium. And there's not as much of a difference as I would like to see. When running at 900p low as well, the outside surface temperature was about 46 degrees. Up next, we have Layers of Fear by Blooper Team. Now this is an Unreal Engine 5 game, and it is very pretty. I first tried the game at 1080p medium with metal effects on quality. The frame rate is anywhere from about 40 to 60 FPS. In some very challenging scenes with a lot of on-screen effects, such as here, when there's a lot of fire going on, it can drop down into the low 30s. Metal effects makes a significant difference in this game. For example, here is 1080p medium with metal effects off, and the game is typically quite a bit below 30 frames. So I would definitely suggest using metal effects in this game if you want it to be more enjoyable. The max outside surface temperature for this game reached about 46.4 degrees. Let's take a look at Feral Interactive's Total War PHARAOH. This game has a benchmark mode, like a lot of these Total War games. I first tried the game at its default settings, which Feral Interactive recommend people use on this machine or any Mac. In this instance, the game will, by default, run at 1768 by 992 with a 30 FPS cap, and most of the settings are set to medium. In the battle benchmark, the game received an average frame rate of 30 FPS. In the campaign benchmark, the game received an average frame rate of 30 FPS. And in the Siege benchmark, the game received an average FPS of, you guessed it, 30 FPS. I then tried the game at 1080p medium with AMD FSR 1.0 enabled and an 80% resolution scale. In the battle benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 90.3 FPS. In the campaign benchmark, the game received an average frame rate of 114.2 FPS. And in the Siege benchmark, the game received an average frame rate of 88.0 FPS. I then wanted to see how the game would fare with AMD FSR disabled at the same settings. In the Battle Benchmark mode, the game received an average FPS of 75.2 FPS. In the Campaign Benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 81.4 FPS. And finally, in the Siege benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 57.6 FPS. This game received a max outside surface temperature of 48.9 degrees with this title. Moving on, we also have Feral Interactive's slightly older title, Warhammer III, which is way more demanding than Total War PHARAOH. Let's have a look at Feral's recommended settings for this title, which is 1768 by 992 resolution, a 30 FPS cap, and most of the settings are set to medium. First, let's see how the game does in the battle benchmark. It sees an average FPS of 30 FPS. I was an idiot and put the stupid HUD right where the average FPS displays, but I can still see it. Moving on, we have the campaign benchmark, seeing an average FPS of 30 FPS once again. And in the Mirrors of Madness benchmark, it sees an average FPS of, you guessed it, 30 FPS. I then tried the game at 1080p medium with AMD FSR enabled and a resolution scale of 70%. In the battle benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 34.2 FPS. In the campaign benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 39.5 FPS. And finally, in the Mirrors of Madness benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 31.9 FPS. So how does AMD FSR affect the performance when it's disabled at the same settings? Well, here is Battle Benchmark, which received an average FPS of something, I'm waiting for it, 27.6 FPS. In the campaign benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 22.9 FPS. And finally, in the Mirrors of Madness benchmark, the game received an average FPS of 23.3 FPS. This title reached a max outside surface temperature of 46.4 degrees. Metro Exodus by 4A Games, probably one of the oldest titles on this list, but it's still worth taking a look at because it's a good game, it's really good. I first tried the game at 1080p medium. Here I am on my journey through the Caspian. The frame rate is anywhere from about 30 to 45 FPS. Now here we are in Yam Anatu. I don't know how to pronounce the name of this place, but here we are. I was hoping the FPS would be a little higher here due to being indoors, but it's really not that much different. In fact, this scene in particular is quite difficult, going below 30 frames. Not ideal. The outside surface temperature at 1080p medium for me reached about 45.8 degrees. When playing at 1080p low, the frame rate was definitely a little bit better. I would have liked it to be a bit higher, but yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. But you can see the results on screen now. It's not that much different in either the Caspian or Yamana 2, however you pronounce that name. When playing at 1080p low, the max outside surface temperature was 45.5 degrees. Our last game to look at is NBA 2K24 Arcade Edition. Now, I've shown these titles quite often on this channel, but it's still worth going over. This game, and for some stupid reason, has a max resolution of 1080p in-game. Anyway, this is 1080p ultra high, basically max settings, and I've got, who have I got? The Los Angeles Lakers versus the Golden State Warriors. Two popular teams apparently, but I did just Google search that, and then I did spectator mode, and after playing the game for 15 minutes, it didn't go below 60 FPS once. Not that surprising because this is definitely not a demanding title. It's the mobile version of NBA 2K24, so it's what you would expect. But still, it's a very popular game on Mac and so forth, so it was still worth showing in. The temperature of this one was very low, at about 38.5 degrees. So, what do we think of gaming on the new 15-inch MacBook Air with M3? One thing that I'm really impressed with, or slightly impressed with, is that the device didn't get as hot as I thought it would. It got up to about 50 degrees with most games, and a lot of them didn't even get up to 50 degrees. Having no fan in this machine still means games will be impacted by performance in the long run, but it wasn't as bad as previous Apple Silicon MacBook Airs. Still, most games are best played at 30 FPS for the best experience, and 1080p, and in some cases 1440p and higher-ish settings. So if you're happy with 30 frames, you can have an okay time here. But you're still probably better off just getting a gaming PC or a Windows PC. And the other issue is that there are just not many games to play. unless you want to do emulation or play games through crossover or parallels or whiskey or whatever. I just don't really show that on this channel. You can go to Andrew Zai for that. I just don't really go into that. I like native games. That's what I enjoy. So yeah. There's something else I really wanted to say. I just couldn't remember what it was. Another thing to consider is that a lot of these new games that have been coming to Mac, well, mostly last year, are not very good ports and have a lot of issues on Mac, and a lot of them need to be updated as well for M3 hardware. So do consider that as well. They don't provide a good example of the MacBook Air's performance right now because they're just pretty lazy ports. Some of them, not all of them, some of them absolutely are fantastic, like Resident Evil Village or Resident Evil 4 or Death Stranding, just not games like Baldur's Gate 3 or Stray or Layers of Fear and so forth. Anyway, thank you guys for watching the video. My name's Stewie, and I'll see you next time. I'm sorry that this wasn't the most in-depth video compared to my other ones. I usually test like 35 or so games. I just don't have very much time at the moment, but I hope you still enjoyed the 15 games that I showcased. A lot of people are going to be like going, where was Dota? Where was chess? You know, I can't test every game, guys. I'm just one person.